The red stains on Jamie's neck weren't from the spilled wine. They were the marks of a man who thought he could buy anything in this city. And Shin Mu-yeol didn't just own this penthouse, he owned every breath taken inside it. For months, Jamie Lee had been the only quiet thing in his violent world, a girl who served his coffee with steady hands and downcast eyes. But as the glass shattered at Do-hyeon's table, that silence was over. The 045 seconds timer on the security feed started the moment Mu-yeol's hand clamped onto the chaebol heir's shoulder. Jamie stammered an apology, her fingers trembling as she tried to wipe the vintage red from the table, but Mu-yeol wasn't looking at the mess. He was looking at the distinct, angry flush on her skin where Do-hyeon had grabbed her. To the rest of the city, Do-hyeon was an untouchable prince of industry. To Mu-yeol, he was just a stain that needed to be scrubbed out. The decision was made before the wine even finished soaking into the carpet. The Golden Boy was about to become a national example. Your support helps us bring these stories to life.
The silence in the penthouse was heavier than the humid night air outside. Shin Mu-yeol didn't move, his hand still anchored to Do-hyeon's shoulder like a predator's claw. Beneath his palm, he felt the frantic, uneven thrumming of the younger man's pulse. Do-hyeon's face was a mask of pale sweat and indignity, his eyes darting toward the security cameras he assumed were on his side. "You're making a mistake, Mu-yeol," Do-hyeon spat, though his voice lacked its usual bite. He reached into his inner breast pocket with trembling fingers, pulling out a leather-bound checkbook. The sound of the pen scratching against paper was the only noise in the room, sharp and desperate. "I know how this works. You want a piece of the new development project? Or is this about the girl's distress? Name your price and let's stop this theater." He ripped the check away and held it up, a number with enough zeros to buy 10 restaurants like this one. He shoved it toward Mu-yeol's chest, a smug, ugly confidence returning to his lips. "Consider it a tip, for her and for your silence. We're both businessmen, aren't we?" Mu-yeol looked down at the paper, then at Jamie. She was still frozen, her eyes fixed on the check as if it were a brand. To her, that paper represented the terrifying reality that her pain had a market value to men like Do-hyeon. Mu-yeol's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. He took the check with his free hand. For a heartbeat, Do-hyeon smirked, thinking he'd won. Then, with agonizing slowness, Mu-yeol shredded the paper into tiny, jagged confetti. He let the pieces flutter down, landing in the pool of spilled red wine on the table. "You think your father's money can wash the marks off her skin?" Mu-yeol leaned in, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that only Do-hyeon could hear. The scent of expensive cologne and cold iron rolled off him. "You didn't just break a glass in my house, Do-hyeon. You broke the only thing here I actually liked." He gripped Do-hyeon's jaw, forcing the heir to look at the timer on the wall. The red digits bled into the darkness. "It's 11:15 p.m. You have exactly 24 hours to settle your affairs, say goodbye to your inheritance, and disappear from the city. If the sun sets tomorrow and you're still within my reach, I won't be asking for a check. I'll be taking the change in bone and blood." He shoved Do-hyeon back into his chair. The Golden Boy stumbled, his prestige collapsing along with his posture. Mu-yeol turned his back on him, his focus shifted entirely to Jamie. The predator was gone, replaced by a man whose gaze was suddenly uncomfortably soft. "Jamie," he said quietly, "go home. The rest of this is mine."
The penthouse office was a tomb of shadows, lit only by the amber glow of a half-empty glass of scotch and the flickering monitors of the syndicate's digital nerve center. Shin Mu-yeol sat behind his mahogany desk, his tattoos catching the low light as he watched a progress bar crawl across the screen. Across from him, Mateo, his most trusted strategist, stood with a thick manila folder that seemed to vibrate with the weight of the secrets it held. "The 24-hour clock is ticking, Mateo," Mu-yeol murmured, his voice like grinding stones. "Tell me everything about our Golden Boy that the newspapers are too paid off to print." Mateo didn't speak immediately. Instead, he spread a series of photographs across the desk. They weren't photos of boardrooms or galas. They were hospital intake forms, non-disclosure agreements signed in trembling script, and grainy CCTV stills from high-end hotels. "Do-hyeon isn't just a drunk with a temper, boss," Mateo said, his professional detachment slipping just enough to reveal a sliver of disgust. "He's a serial predator. We found 3 other women in the last 2 years, a college intern, a flight attendant, and a hostess from a rival club. All of them disappeared from the public eye within weeks of meeting him." Mu-yeol picked up a document, a settlement agreement worth $500,000, dated 6 months prior. The victim had claimed severe nerve damage in her wrist, the same place Jamie had been marked. The family's legal team handles the cleanup, Mateo continued. They buy the silence, they threaten the families, and they move him to the next playground. Jamie wasn't a random target. She was just the latest girl he thought he could break because she didn't have a name that mattered. Mu-yeol felt a cold, familiar rage coil in his gut, a darkness that went deeper than mere territorial protection. This wasn't just a breach of his restaurant's peace. It was a systemic rot that Do-hyeon believed himself entitled to. He looked at the photo of the college intern, her face blurred by a bruise that mirrored the one on Jamie's neck. He thinks he's a collector, he whispered, his grip tightening until the glass in his hand hairline fractured. He thinks these women are trophies he can buy and discard. He spent his whole life thinking money as a shield. He has no idea that to a man like me, his money is just paper to start a fire. He stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the marble floor. The hunt was no longer just about a spilled drink or a bruised ego. It was about dismantling a monster who had been protected by his own shadow for too long. Gather the files on the protection rackets his father runs. If he wants to use his family's influence as a weapon, I'll make sure that weapon misfires in his face. By tomorrow night, the city won't just know what he did to Jamie. They'll know the name of every woman he ever tried to erase.
The following evening, the city's elite gathered at the Grand Luminous Gala, a sea of silk and arrogance, hosted by the very conglomerate Do-hyeon called home. Do-hyeon was there, appearing restored by the morning light, leaning against a marble pillar with a flute of champagne and the practiced smirk of a man who believed the previous night's threats were merely a bad dream. He was surrounded by sycophants, laughing at a joke about a stock merger, convinced that his family's shadow was long enough to hide any sin. High above the ballroom, the massive digital billboards that usually displayed soaring stock prices and luxury watches suddenly flickered. The jazz ensemble faltered as the screens went black for a heartbeat, before erupting in a jagged neon red. The first image wasn't of a product, but a document, a scanned police report from 2 years ago, redacted by the state, but now fully exposed. Then came the audio. It wasn't music, it was a recording from a hidden mic, Do-hyeon's own voice, cold and entitled, detailing exactly what he intended to do to a hostess who had refused him. "My father owns the precinct," the recording hissed through the high-fidelity speakers, echoing off the gold-leafed ceiling. "You're not a person, you're an expense." The room went deathly silent. Every head turned to the screens, then to Do-hyeon. The smirk died on his face, replaced by a gray, hollow mask of terror. Beside him, his father, the chairman, watched in frozen horror as a scrolling list of names began to play. The women the family had paid to vanish, their settlement amounts listed like line items on a balance sheet. The first strike wasn't a bullet, it was the truth, weaponized and broadcast to the very people whose respect Do-hyeon lived for. From the shadows of the mezzanine, Shin Mu-yeol watched the chaos unfold. He stood with his arms crossed, his tattoos hidden beneath a pristine suit, looking like a dark god presiding over a collapse he had orchestrated with surgical precision. He wasn't looking at the screens, however. He was looking at Jamie, who stood near the service entrance, her tray trembling. For the first time, she wasn't looking at the floor. She was looking directly at Do-hyeon, her eyes wide as she realized that the monster wasn't untouchable. Mu-yeol tapped his watch. 12 hours remained. The public execution of Do-hyeon's reputation was only the beginning. He had stripped the boy of his name. Next, he would strip him of his safety. As the first cameras from the national news crews began to flash in the lobby, Mu-yeol turned away, disappearing into the darkness of the corridor. The golden boy was officially tarnished, and the city was finally starting to listen.
The aftermath of the gala leak was a cold, suffocating weight that settled over the city. By midnight, the penthouse was no longer a place of business. It was a war room. The elevator chimed, and Chairman Kang, Do-hyeon's father, stepped out. He didn't look like a grieving parent. He looked like a titan whose foundations were cracking. He walked with the heavy, rhythmic thud of a man used to being feared, his face a mask of controlled fury as he faced Shin Mu-yeol. "You've had your fun, Mu-yeol," the chairman said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He didn't sit. He stood in the center of the room, flanked by 2 lawyers who looked more like vultures in expensive wool. "You've embarrassed my son. You've bruised our stock price. But you are a gutter rat playing at being a king. If those screens don't go dark, and if a public apology isn't issued by dawn, I will move the weight of the Blue House, the National Police, and every bank in this country to crush your syndicate into the dirt. I will bury you so deep, the world will forget you ever breathed." Mu-yeol didn't flinch. He didn't even look up from the small leather-bound volume he was holding, the Red Book. It was an unassuming thing, weathered and frayed at the edges, but as he laid it on the mahogany desk, the chairman's lawyers visibly paled. "Your son thinks money is a shield, and you think power is a blunt instrument," Mu-yeol said, his voice chillingly calm. He flipped the book open to a page dated 5 years ago. But power is actually just a series of secrets held by the right people. This book contains the exact dates, account numbers, and names of every politician your conglomerate has bought since the 90s. It lists the offshore tax havens, the donations that were actually bribes, and the specific murders your security team covered up to keep your construction projects on schedule. Mu-yeol looked up then, his dark eyes reflecting the cold city lights. "I don't care about your stocks. I don't care about your threats. You came here to protect your legacy, but you should have spent that time teaching your son not to touch what belongs to me." The chairman reached for the book, his hand trembling, but Mu-yeol slammed his palm down on it. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "If you move against my people, if you even think about calling the police, I won't just leak these pages to the press. I'll hand the original to the International Court. I will burn your empire to the ground just to keep the fire warm for Jamie." The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time in 30 years, Chairman Kang looked small. He realized he wasn't negotiating with a businessman. He was staring into the eyes of a man who was perfectly willing to go to hell, as long as he could drag the Kangs down with him. The empire didn't just tremble, it began to tilt. Without a word, the chairman turned and retreated, his shadow fleeing before him. Mu-yeol watched him go, his grip on the Red Book tightening. The clock was still ticking, and the real violence had yet to begin.
The downfall of the Kang dynasty happened not with a bang, but with the cold, clinical sound of a silver spoon hitting a porcelain floor. By dawn, the new cycle had chewed through Do-hyeon's reputation and spit out the remains. The conglomerate issued a formal statement, a bloodless paragraph that disowned him, stripped him of his titles, and scrubbed his name from the family trust. He was no longer a prince of industry, he was a liability being liquidated. Do-hyun sat in the back of a black sedan, watching the iron gates of his father's estate swing shut for the last time. His phone was a graveyard of ignored texts and disconnected lines. The golden boy was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed man with nothing left to lose but his pride, and that was a dangerous thing to leave in the hands of a coward. His mind, fueled by expensive whiskey and the shattering of his ego, looped back to a single image, Jamie Lee. He didn't blame the boss, and he didn't blame his father. In the twisted logic of his entitlement, he blamed the girl who had dared to be noticed by a man like Mu-yeol. If he was going into the dirt, he decided he wouldn't go alone. He would take the one thing the boss valued, a final act of spite to prove that even a broken man could still leave a scar. "Go to the service entrance of the penthouse," Do-hyun rasped to his driver, his voice thick with a frantic, serrated edge. "She'll be leaving her shift soon. We're taking her." The driver hesitated, seeing the madness glinting in the heir's eyes. "Sir," the chairman said. "The chairman is dead to me," Do-hyun screamed, slamming his fist into the leather upholstery. "Everyone is dead to me. Just drive." As the car sped through the rain-slicked streets toward the restaurant, Do-hyun gripped a small, heavy object in his pocket. He wasn't thinking about the syndicate's reach or the Red Book. He was thinking about the look of terror he wanted to see back on Jamie's face, the only thing that made him feel powerful. High above in the restaurant, Jamie was untying her apron, her movements slow and weary. The adrenaline of the gala had faded, leaving a cold, prickling sensation at the back of her neck. She looked at the exit, then at the heavy rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. She didn't see the black sedan pulling into the shadows of the loading dock. She didn't see the predator who had lost his cage and was now hunting for blood. All she felt was a sudden, inexplicable urge to find Mu-yeol, but the boss was nowhere to be seen, and the 24-hour clock was down to its final, frantic minutes. The rain had turned into a torrential assault by the time Jamie reached her apartment, the city lights blurring into smears of neon through the taxi window. She didn't notice the shadow that slipped through the lobby doors behind her, nor did she see the 2 black SUVs idling at the corner. Within the Mu-yeol Syndicate's command center, a digital alarm suddenly wailed. The 0:45 seconds timer flared onto the primary monitor, a countdown triggered by the silent breach of Jamie's front door. "Boss, we have a problem," Mateo's voice crackled over the radio, tense and sharp. The security detail at the safe house was hit. A distraction team blocked the main artery with a staged accident. Our men are pinned down 3 blocks away. Mu-yeol was already moving, his suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark ink of a tiger coiling around his forearm. Status of the apartment. The secondary perimeter was bypassed. Someone had a master key. He's inside, boss. Inside the darkened flat, the air was thick with the scent of wet wool and cheap courage. Jamie stood in the center of her small living room, her breath hitching as she saw the silhouette by the window. Do-hyeon looked like a ghost of his former self, his tie undone, his eyes wide and bloodshot, a jagged piece of glass from a broken bottle gripped in his trembling hand. "You think he saved you?" Do-hyeon hissed, the sound barely human. He stepped into the sliver of moonlight, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the floor. "He didn't save you, Jamie. He just wanted a better view of your destruction. My father is gone. My life is gone. What do you think happens to the reason for all of it?" Jamie backed away, her heel catching on the edge of the rug. She reached for her phone, but Do-hyeon lunged, swatting it across the room. It skittered into the shadows, its screen glowing with a frantic missed call from a restricted number. "The timer is at 30 seconds. Mateo's voice echoed in Mu-yeol's earpiece as the boss slammed his car into gear, the tires screaming against the asphalt. The distance felt like an ocean. In the apartment, Jamie's back hit the cold brick wall. The fear that had defined her for months suddenly sharpened into something else, a jagged, cold clarity. She looked at the heavy brass paperweight on her desk, a gift from a sister who told her never to let a man make her small. As Do-hyeon raised the glass shard, his face twisted in a final, pathetic attempt at dominance, Jamie didn't scream. She watched the red digits of her bedside clock flip. The countdown was almost over, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for a savior. She was waiting for an opening.
The space between them felt like an open wound, raw and bleeding. Do-hyeon took another step forward, the glass shard in his hand catching the red pulse of the neon sign outside. He was rambling now, a disjointed litany of lost millions and broken legacies. But Jamie wasn't listening to his words anymore. She was looking at his eyes, hollow, frantic, and fundamentally weak. For months, she had lived in the shadow of this man's name, convinced that his power was absolute. But as he stood there, shivering in his ruined suit, she realized that he was just a man made of paper and glass. Her hand drifted back toward the mahogany side table. There, sitting in its silver cradle, was an unopened bottle of vintage Cabernet, the very gift Do-hyeon had sent to her apartment weeks ago, as a gesture of appreciation that felt more like a brand. It was heavy, cold, and a symbol of everything he thought he could buy. "You're nothing without him," Do-hyeon sneered, his voice cracking. "Once the boss gets bored of his little project, you'll be back in the gutter where you belong." He lunged. It wasn't the calculated strike of a fighter, but the desperate flailing of a coward. Jamie didn't freeze. The 0:45 seconds on the timer of her mind had run out, and in its place was a cold, white-hot resolve. She didn't retreat. She stepped into his guard, her fingers curling around the neck of the wine bottle. With a scream that was less about fear and more about an exorcism of the last few months, she swung. The heavy glass base of the bottle collided with Do-hyeon's temple, with a sickening, muffled thud. The impact sent a shockwave up her arm, but she didn't let go. Do-hyeon's eyes rolled back, the glass shard falling from his nerveless fingers as he collapsed onto the rug he had bled his arrogance all over. She stood over him, her chest heaving, the bottle still gripped in her hand. The wine inside hadn't spilled, but the power dynamic had shattered completely. She looked down at the man who had terrified her, and for the first time, she felt nothing but a distant, quiet pity. She wasn't the waitress from the penthouse anymore. She wasn't a favorite or a project. She was the person who had ended the fight. The front door kicked open with a thunderous crash, and Shin Mu-yeol burst in, his gun drawn and his eyes wild with a rare, panicked terror. He stopped dead in the entryway, his gaze moving from the unconscious heir on the floor to the woman standing over him with the heavy bottle. Mu-yeol lowered his weapon, the silence in the room suddenly deafening. He didn't move toward the body. He looked at Jamie, really looked at her, and saw the way she held her shoulders. The flinch was gone. The shadows in her eyes had been replaced by a fierce, steady light. "I didn't need the timer, Mu-yeol," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but as strong as iron. Mu-yeol didn't speak. He simply stepped aside, giving her the space she had finally earned for herself. The victim had died in that room, but the survivor was just getting started. Mu-yeol stepped over the threshold, the silence of the room heavier than the storm outside. He didn't look at the man groaning on the floor. His eyes remained locked on Jamie. He saw the wine bottle in her hand, the steady rise and fall of her chest, and the ghost of a predator's chill left him. She wasn't a victim to be rescued. She was a survivor who had already claimed her territory. "Is he dead?" Mu-yeol asked, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to steady the air. "No," Jamie replied, her voice unwavering. "But he's finally quiet." Mu-yeol turned his attention to Do-hyeon. He reached down, grabbing the heir by his expensive silk lapels and dragging him upright. Do-hyeon's head lolled, blood trickling from his temple where the vintage glass had made its mark. He looked pathetic, a hollowed-out prince of nothing. Mu-yeol threw him into a chair and signaled to Mateo, who appeared in the doorway carrying a tripod and a professional-grade camera. "You wanted to be famous, Do-hyeon," Mu-yeol said, his voice dropping into a lethal, silky tone. "You wanted the city to know your name. I'm going to make sure they never forget it." Mateo set the camera, the lens staring at Do-hyeon like an unblinking eye. With a single tap, the red live light flickered to life, broadcasting directly to every major news outlet in the country and the syndicate's hijacked billboards. Mu-yeol placed a single sheet of paper on the table and a heavy fountain pen. "This isn't a settlement. It's a full, detailed confession. Every woman you hurt, every bribe your father paid, and exactly what you tried to do to Jamie tonight. Sign it. Then, you're going to read it. To everyone." Do-hyeon looked at the camera, then at the pen. "My father, he'll kill you for this. Your father disowned you 5 hours ago," Mu-yeol whispered, leaning in so close their foreheads nearly touched. "Right now you have two choices. You can sign this and spend the rest of your life in a cell, or I can turn that camera off and handle this the traditional way. I think we both know you don't have the stomach for the second option." With trembling hands, Do-hyeon gripped the pen. The scratching of ink on paper was the sound of an empire finally collapsing. As he began to speak into the lens, his voice cracking as he admitted to his crimes before millions of viewers, Jamie felt the last of the invisible chains fall away. Mu-yeol stood by her side, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the heat of his presence. He didn't look at the camera or the confession. He watched the woman who had fought her own way out of the dark. The punishment wasn't just the prison sentence awaiting Do-hyeon. It was the fact that for the rest of his life, the world would see him exactly as Jamie did. Small, broken, and utterly powerless.
The morning light broke over the city not with a whisper, but with the roar of a digital revolution. By 6 a.m., the footage of Do-hyeon's confession had saturated every corner of the internet, racking up millions of views before the sun had even cleared the horizon. The image of the golden boy, weeping in a dimly lit apartment, contrasted against the stoic, tattooed silhouette of Shin Mu-yeol standing guard over Jamie, became the defining image of the year. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a cultural reckoning. Public outrage surged through the streets with a speed that the legal system couldn't ignore. The Blue House was forced to issue an emergency statement, and by 7:30 a.m., a fleet of police cruisers, their sirens wailing in a chorus of overdue justice, descended on the Kang estate. For the first time in his life, the chairman couldn't buy his way out. The Red Book had effectively paralyzed the family's influence, leaving the police with no choice but to lead the heir away in handcuffs, as a swarm of news cameras captured his final, humiliating descent into the back of a van. Back at the penthouse, the air was still and cool. The jazz had long since stopped, and the heavy smell of rain had been replaced by the crisp, clean scent of the coming day. Shin Mu-yeol stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his hands in his pockets, watching the city wake up to a world he had fundamentally altered. Jamie walked up beside him, no longer wearing the black and white uniform of a servant. She wore a simple jacket, her shoulders square, her gaze fixed on the orange glow bleeding across the skyline. "The news says I'm a hero," Mu-yeol said, his voice quiet, almost ironical. "They've forgotten I'm a man who breaks bones for a living. They've turned me into a fairy tale." Jamie looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see a boss or a monster. She saw a man who had used his darkness to create a sliver of light for someone else. "You didn't do it for the news," she said, "and I didn't survive it for them either." He turned to her, the rising sun catching the gold chain at his throat and the fierce, protective depth in his eyes. He reached out,
his tattooed hand hovering for a second before he gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. He didn't pull her into a cage. He simply stood there, a partner in the quiet aftermath of the storm. "The city will be different today," Mu-yeol whispered, as the sun finally broke over the skyscrapers, bathing them both in a warm, golden light. "And so will we." Jamie watched the light reflect off the glass, a small, genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. The 45-second timer was gone. The bruises were fading. For the first time in her life, she wasn't hiding from the day. She was stepping into it, and she wasn't walking alone.